Hi, Joe. Sarah from the upcoming. A pleasure to meet you. And well, how's it going?
Very good, thank you.
So, can you tell us why you were compelled to put Ted Bundy's story on the screen again, and why this slightly non-conventional approach of going from Elizabeth's viewpoint?
Yeah, well, I think the lessons of Bundy can't be overstated. He's a guy who defies all stereotypes of what we think a serial killer is. We want to think a serial killer is some dark, mean, twisted, and of course they are, social outcast that can't fit into society, because that implies that you can identify the serial killer a mile away and maybe avoid the fate of becoming a victim. But what Bundy teaches us is that the people we least expect and sometimes most often trust are the people who do the worst evil in this world. Whether it's a priest who commits pedophilia and then holds mass the next day, or as we've learned in the recent Michael Jackson documentary, somebody like Michael Jackson who takes advantage of the trust of parents. There are certain people who do terrible things that are very close to us, and I think that lesson is very important for a younger generation in this era of internet catfishing and people pretending to be one thing when they're not. The first thing I did when I decided to make the film was I called my two college-age daughters up who were in college, and they're very smart young women who go to good schools, and which I didn't have any help getting them into those schools, by the way. Another controversy. And they had never heard of Bundy, and so I thought for a new generation that this lesson that people are, often, don't trust somebody because of how they look and feel. And so the choice of Zac Efron, who is a heartthrob for a certain demographic and who can do no wrong to a certain group of people, is the perfect casting choice, because that's the message of the movie. Just because you look and act a certain way doesn't mean you should trust them.
Yeah, an incredible cast, Lily Collins, but in particular Zac Efron, not an obvious choice, but he seems to really seduce the audience in the way that he did everyone else, and I think he just seems to nail it in that way. So how did you work with him to get this to happen?
Well, Zac was my first choice, and I had to cajole him a bit to do it, and luckily he eventually said yes. But working on the movie, the number one thing that with both Zac and Lily that I wanted to emphasize was that relationship needs to feel real, that they really do love each other. I wanted that relationship to burn off the screen so that by the end of the movie, you almost forget that it's Bundy until the end, when he finally admits what he did to her at the end of the movie. And therefore the audience can have that same level of disgust and betrayal that Lily feels. I actually want people, when he does a prison escape, I hope I'm not giving away too much of my own movie, but when he breaks out of prison, I want the audience, a part of them, to be rooting for that relationship, because by the end of the movie, I want the audience to say, oh my God, I was actually liking this character in the first half of the movie, because that dramatizes and epitomizes the level of betrayal and that these people have when they deceive you. Well, I think the biggest challenge was convincing people that this was a good story to tell. We live in an age of Me Too accountability, which I wholeheartedly subscribe to. We live in an age where there's a lot of true crime, and why make another movie? And the answer to me is tell the story through the perspective of the female victim. Tell the story of how serial killers deceive and manipulate, and it'd be easy to make another film about how a serial killer kills, the escalating body count, the police procedural, and by the end of the movie they catch their man. But that's been done, and I think it's much more important to understand that serial killers are not two-dimensional monsters that only kill. They also have a whole other life, and they deceive people. And Bundy eluded capture for so long because everyone liked him and thought he was a swell guy. And so portraying that, to me, was an interesting approach and a way to kind of turn the serial killer genre on its head. Now, some have said, who haven't seen the movie, some have said, oh, you're glorifying because you're not showing the violence. To me, that's crazy. Showing the violence, to me, is more disrespectful to the victims. If you've been the victim of a horrible murder and rape, I don't think the family members want to see that recreated on screen. We talk about violence. We don't avoid the violence, but we don't show Zac actually doing the killing. Well, he worked very hard, and it's a heavy burden to be playing this type of character. He just worked you know, he's not this kind of method actor who needs to 24/7 be the character, but he certainly did a lot.
There's the man there.
Right. I guess the star is here. Well, you know, the documentary series Conversations with a Killer is a deep dive into the mind of the killer. We learn exactly what was on his mind while he was killing, and the movie to me is a perfect opportunity to show the other half of that coin. The movie Extremely Wicked is a deep dive into the mind of the victim and the mindset of the victim and how the serial killer deceives. You know. There have been a ton of movies. About how serial killers kill, and most serial killer movies, and there's many great ones, so I'm not knocking them, but there are many serial killer movies that, you know, it's a police procedural. We see an escalating body count, and by the end of the movie, they've caught the killer. This is, to me, a different look at how the rest of the life of the killer is. You know, how do they act normal? How do they fit into society? Because in my experience, you know, the people who do the worst in life, the people who do the most evil in the world, are the people you least expect and most often trust. I think, you know, in this age of internet catfishing and people pretending to be one thing when they're really another, I think it's a very important message to put out to young people, to Zac and Lily's demographic, that just because somebody looks and acts a certain way, you shouldn't necessarily trust them. I mean, I think the lessons of Bundy can't be overstated. You know, he defied all stereotypes of what we think a serial killer is. Well, I think anyone who's criticizing the need for the film hasn't seen the film. I mean, you know, for example, there's been some, well, first of all, a lot of people love the film or are defending it once they see it. You know, I can't remember the last time I saw a film where you see it from the perspective of the victims. And, you know, Bundy deceived the American media, made him into a folk hero. Bundy deceived the judicial system because, you know, he was allowed to kind of make a mockery of the courtroom. We see that in the movie. You know, people had a little bit of a knee-jerk reaction. Oh, Zac Efron, Disney star, that must mean you're glorifying. But the last thing we're doing is glorifying him. We're making Bundy into the three-dimensional human being he is, not to glorify him, so that people can be warned and understand that those who do evil in the world, you know, aren't the two-dimensional monsters who you can spot a mile away. It's the people closest to you. I mean, Bundy himself said, killers don't come out of the shadows with long teeth and blood dripping off their chin. They're your brother, your father, people you're close to, people you've admired, and that's a lesson that can't be repeated enough. I hope so. You know, first and foremost, it's a fun film, and so, you know, you can't just bang a message over people's heads. You have to give them a satisfying viewing experience, and I think some of the things that go on in this film, you know, and it takes a very dark turn at the end, and, you know, we certainly give him his due, and the last thing we're doing, as I say, is glorifying him. He is alone on death row at the end of the movie. You know, so yeah, so I hope people enjoy the film and are provoked by it, but I also hope they are reminded, particularly my daughter's generation. You know, the first thing I did when I decided to make the movie. Oh, hey!
Sorry, I don't want to interrupt your interview.
Oh my God,
Hi, you here? It's not Sundance.
yeah, oh my God.
Of course I do. Star of the movie. Every time you look so beautiful in this movie. It's such an amazing
Anyway, she did an amazing job.